I, 25F, have always had a complicated relationship with my brother Brian, 28M. Growing up in a middle-class family in a suburban neighborhood, our dynamic was always skewed in Brian's favor. From our earliest years, he was clearly our parents' favorite child, the golden boy who could do no wrong in their eyes. While he got praise for average grades, I was criticized for not getting perfect scores. When he got in trouble at school for fighting, our parents defended him, saying the other kids must have provoked him. But when I got detention once for being late to class, I was grounded for a month. This favoritism became even more apparent in our teenage years. Brian was allowed to stay out late, go to parties, and date whoever he wanted. Meanwhile, I had strict curfews, limited social activities, and was constantly reminded not to embarrass the family. Our parents even gave Brian their old car when he turned 16, while I had to work part-time jobs through high school to save up for my own vehicle. Brian's dating history has always been problematic. In high school, he was known as the guy who would date multiple girls at once, often from different schools so they wouldn't find out about each other. Our parents knew about this and would laugh it off, saying he was just sowing his wild oats and that boys will be boys. I remember one incident where one of his girlfriends came to our house crying after finding out he was cheating on her with her cousin. Instead of holding Brian accountable, our mom told the girl she should have known better than to expect commitment from a teenage boy. College didn't change Brian's behavior; if anything, it got worse. He joined a fraternity and became notorious for hooking up with girls while in relationships. He would brag about it at family dinners, and our parents would just smile proudly, like their son's ability to manipulate women was some sort of achievement. Meanwhile, they constantly lectured me about maintaining my reputation and not being one of those girls. After college, I struggled to find a well-paying job in my field and ended up moving into our parents' guest house. It's a small space above the garage that they originally built for our grandmother before she passed away. I pay them rent, but it's still significantly less than what I'd pay for an apartment in our area. This arrangement has made me somewhat dependent on them, which Brian loves to hold over my head. Brian, on the other hand, moved back into his old room in the main house after graduation. He got a job at a local marketing firm through our dad's connections and has been living rent-free ever since. Our parents justify this by saying he's saving for his future while I'm just not trying hard enough to succeed. Last year, Brian started dating Melanie, 26F, and I have to admit, I was shocked by how different she was from his usual type. While he typically went for party girls or social media influencer types, Melanie was a pediatric nurse who spent her free time volunteering at animal shelters. She was smart, compassionate, and genuinely kind, the type of person who would bring soup when you were sick or remember your favorite coffee order after meeting you just once. I first met Melanie when she came over for a family dinner. Unlike Brian's previous girlfriends who would ignore me or treat me with condescension, Melanie made a point to include me in conversations and showed genuine interest in my life. After dinner, she helped me with the dishes, something Brian never did, and we ended up talking for hours about our shared love of true crime podcasts and horror movies. Over the next few months, Melanie and I developed a friendship. She would often invite me to join her and Brian for movies or dinner, and sometimes we would hang out just the two of us when Brian was working late. She confided in me about her past relationships and how refreshing it was to be with someone like Brian who seemed so committed and honest. The irony of her words made my stomach turn, but at that point, I had no reason to believe Brian wasn't being faithful to her. Brian seemed different with Melanie too. He stopped going to bars every weekend, started talking about settling down, and even adopted a cat with her, though our parents ended up taking care of it most of the time. Our parents were ecstatic about the relationship, constantly praising Melanie's family background and her career success. They saw her as the perfect addition to our family and would often hint about wanting grandchildren. After 8 months of dating, Brian proposed to Melanie during a family dinner at an expensive restaurant. He had our parents and her parents there, along with their closest friends. The proposal was elaborate, with a photographer, a string quartet, and a custom-made ring that I later found out Melanie's parents had helped pay for. She said yes, of course, and everyone celebrated late into the night. The engagement period started with a flurry of activity. Our parents immediately began planning an extravagant wedding, insisting on paying for most of it despite Melanie's parents offering to share the cost equally. Melanie threw herself into wedding planning, often asking for my opinion on everything from flower arrangements to bridesmaid dresses. She even asked me to be one of her bridesmaids, saying she felt like I had become the sister she never had. Everything seemed perfect until 3 months ago when I stopped at a local coffee shop to grab my usual morning brew. Through the window, I saw Brian and Lori, 27F, Melanie's best friend since college, sitting in a corner booth. At first, I thought nothing of it. Lori was the maid of honor, so it made sense that she might be meeting with Brian to discuss wedding plans. But as I walked in, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Brian and Lori were holding hands across the table, and then they kissed. Not a friendly peck, but a passionate kiss that left no doubt about the nature of their relationship. I stood frozen by the counter, my coffee forgotten, as I watched them act like two people in love, completely oblivious to my presence or the fact that Brian was engaged to Lori's supposed best friend. I left the coffee shop without ordering, my hands shaking so badly I could barely drive home. That evening, when Brian returned home, I confronted him in the kitchen. Instead of showing remorse or trying to deny it, he just smirked and told me to mind my own business. Then he revealed something that made me feel physically sick. He and Lori had been seeing each other for months, even before he proposed to Melanie. When I told him I was going to tell Melanie the truth, his whole demeanor changed. The smirk disappeared, replaced by a cold, threatening look I had seen many times growing up. He reminded me that I was living in our parents' guest house only because they allowed it, and that one word from him could have me kicked out. He made it clear that if I said anything to Melanie about his affair with Lori, he would make sure I ended up homeless. Then he had the audacity to frame it as a test of loyalty, saying that if I was really his sister, I would help him maintain both relationships. He even suggested I could help cover for him when he wanted to spend time with Lori, saying it was the least I could do considering how much our parents had helped me by letting me live in the guest house. Now I'm trapped in an impossible situation. Melanie deserves to know the truth about her fiancé and her best friend's betrayal, but I know Brian wasn't bluffing about getting me kicked out. With my student loan payments and current salary, I can't afford to rent my own place yet. I've seen our parents side with Brian countless times before, no matter how wrong he was, and I know they would believe whatever lies he told them about me. The wedding is a week away, and I feel sick every time I see Melanie excitedly talking about her future with Brian. I'd if I keep quiet to protect myself, even though I know it means letting Melanie marry someone who's betraying her in the worst possible way. Update 1: I need to update everyone on what's happened since my last post. Things have gotten way more complicated and honestly much worse than I could have imagined. Last week, I discovered something that made the entire situation even more disturbing than it already was. I was in our family kitchen on Tuesday evening, making dinner for myself since our parents were out at some charity event. I thought I was alone in the house because Brian had told everyone he was going to a wedding vendor meeting with Melanie. I was listening to music with my earbuds while cooking when I noticed some movement in our front yard through the kitchen window. I saw Brian's car pulling up, but instead of Melanie being with him, it was Lori. I quickly turned off my music but stayed in the kitchen. They came inside, clearly thinking the house was empty because all the lights were off except for the kitchen's, which they couldn't see from the entryway. They went straight to the living room, which shares a wall with the kitchen. I could hear everything clearly through our house's thin walls. At first, I heard Lori crying. Not just subtle sniffling, but deep, body-shaking sobs that made me uncomfortable even from the next room. Then she dropped the bombshell: she was pregnant. She kept saying things like this wasn't supposed to happen and what are we going to do? Brian's response made my skin crawl. His voice was cold, almost annoyed, as he told her she needed to take care of it before the wedding. He said he couldn't risk Melanie finding out, and that Lori was being selfish even bringing this up so close to the wedding date. The cruelty in his voice was something I'd never heard before, even from him. Lori seemed genuinely shocked by his reaction. She started talking about how he had promised to leave Melanie for her, how he had said they would be together properly once he figured out how to break off the engagement without causing a scandal. Brian's laugh in response was horrible, mocking and mean. He told her she was delusional if she ever thought he would leave Melanie for her. Then he said something that made me understand just how manipulative my brother really was. He explained to Lori that Melanie was wife material because of her family's connections and money, while Lori was just fun, someone to pass the time with. He bragged about how marrying Melanie would help his career through her father's business connections, plus her family's money would ensure he never had to worry about finances. But the most shocking part came next. Brian revealed that Melanie wasn't the first of Lori's friends he had dated. He started listing names: Jessica from their sophomore year, Emma during junior year, and Kate right after graduation. Each time, he had used the same pattern, dating one of Lori's friends while keeping Lori as his side piece, always promising her that she was the one he really loved and that he would eventually leave them for her. The whole time he was talking, I had my phone out, recording everything. I knew Brian would probably deny everything later, and I wanted proof. I managed to record about 10 minutes of their conversation before they finally noticed the kitchen light was on and realized someone was home. Brian came storming into the kitchen, his face red with anger. Lori followed behind him, looking mortified when she saw me. Brian demanded to know how long I had been there and if I had heard anything. When he spotted my phone in my hand, he completely lost it. He tried to grab it from me, but I managed to keep it away from him. Later that night, after Lori had left, Brian cornered me in my room above the garage. He was more threatening than I'd ever seen him. He told me if I didn't delete the recording, he would tell our parents that I had been stealing from them. He said he had already planted some of Mom's jewelry in my room as proof. I knew our parents would believe him without question, so I pretended to delete the recording right there in front of him. What he didn't know was that I had already backed it up to my cloud storage. The next day, something unexpected happened. Lori came to see me while Brian was at work. She looked terrible, like she hadn't slept all night. She broke down completely and told me everything, how their affair had been going on for years, long before Melanie was in the picture. She showed me years' worth of messages between them, where Brian would constantly promise to leave whoever he was dating to be with her. The pattern was always the same. Brian would start dating one of her friends, telling Lori it was just for show or to make her jealous. He would keep seeing her secretly, promising that he would leave her friends soon. Then when things inevitably fell apart, he would gaslight her, claiming he never made those promises and that she was crazy for thinking they were more than just casual hookups. Lori admitted she knew it was wrong to keep seeing him while he was with her friends, but said she was too in love with him to stop. She said hearing him talk about her pregnancy so callously finally made her realize he would never change and that she had wasted years of her life believing his lies. Brian must have somehow found out about my conversation with Lori because he came to my room that night in a rage I'd never seen before. He threatened that if I said anything to anyone about what I knew, especially to Melanie, he would make sure I regretted it for the rest of my life. He went into graphic detail about how he would systematically destroy my relationships with our family and make sure I ended up alone and homeless. The next evening at family dinner, Brian started his campaign against me. He casually mentioned to our parents that I seemed jealous of his relationship with Melanie. He told them I had been making weird comments about wanting to ruin his wedding and that he was worried about my mental state. Our parents, predictable as ever, immediately took his side. They spent the rest of dinner lecturing me about how I needed to be more supportive of my brother's happiness and stop letting my jealousy control me. The wedding is now just 2 days away, and things are falling apart. Lori told Melanie she had a family emergency and couldn't be her maid of honor anymore. Melanie called me crying about it, not knowing the real reason her best friend had abandoned her right before her wedding. I'm sick of watching this whole thing unfold, but I'm terrified of what will happen to me if I speak up. Brian has made it clear that he will destroy my life if I ruin this for him, and I know our parents will help him do it. Update 2: Everything finally came to a head today at the wedding, and I still can't believe what happened. After a sleepless night wrestling with my conscience, I decided I couldn't let Melanie walk into this marriage blind. The weight of knowing what Brian and Lori had done was crushing me, and watching everyone celebrate their perfect relationship felt like being complicit in a cruel joke. The wedding was being held at the most expensive church in our city, a massive cathedral with stained glass windows and marble columns. Brian and Melanie's families had spared no expense. There were ice sculptures, thousands of roses, and even a string quartet. The guest list was over 300 people, including many of Melanie's father's business associates. I arrived early, as I was supposed to help with some last-minute preparations. The whole time I was setting up, I kept thinking about the recording on my phone. I had borrowed a small Bluetooth speaker from my friend Sarah the night before, testing it multiple times to make sure it would be loud enough. I hid it under my seat in the third row, where the immediate family was supposed to sit. The ceremony started exactly as planned. Brian stood at the altar, looking perfectly put together in his expensive tuxedo, smiling that fake smile I'd grown to hate. The bridesmaids walked down the aisle. The spot where Lori should have been was painfully obvious. Then the music changed, and everyone stood as the doors opened for Melanie. She looked beautiful in her white dress, beaming with happiness as she walked down the aisle with her father. Her dress alone had cost more than I made in 3 months, and she had spent weeks getting it perfectly altered. Looking at her face, so full of joy and love, I almost lost my nerve. But then I remembered Brian's cold voice talking about using her for her family's money, and I knew what I had to do. Just as Melanie reached the halfway point of the aisle, I stood up. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone, but I managed to connect it to the speaker. The recording started playing, filling the entire church with Brian's voice. "You're delusional if you thought I'd leave Melanie for you. She's wife material, her family's money and connections are exactly what I need. You're just fun, Lori. Nothing more." The silence that followed was deafening. Melanie stopped walking, her bouquet slipping from her hands. Her father's face turned red with anger. Brian's expression changed from confusion to recognition to pure rage in the span of seconds. Then came his voice again, talking about Lori's pregnancy and how she needed to take care of it before the wedding. Brian lunged at me from the altar, knocking over a large flower arrangement in his rush to get to me. He was screaming incoherently about how I had ruined everything. Our father had to physically grab him to stop him from attacking me. Several groomsmen rushed to help restrain him as he continued shouting threats at me. Melanie's father demanded explanations, his voice booming through the church. Standing up on shaky legs, I told everyone everything, about Brian and Lori's long-term affair, about his pattern of using Lori's friends, about the pregnancy, and about his threats to me. I explained how he had bragged about using Melanie for her family's connections and money. The look on Melanie's face was heartbreaking. She stood there in her beautiful white dress, mascara running down her cheeks as she listened to everything. Then something seemed to snap in her. She picked up her bouquet from the floor and threw it directly at Brian's face, hitting him square in the chest. Without saying a word, she turned and ran out of the church, her parents following close behind. Before they left, Melanie's father turned to Brian and said in a voice cold with fury that his lawyers would be in touch about the wedding expenses. He looked at my parents and said they should be ashamed of raising a son like Brian. My mother's reaction was exactly what I had expected. She slapped me hard across the face, right there in front of everyone, screaming about how I had destroyed my brother's life. She called me jealous, spiteful, and evil. My father was quieter but no less angry. He simply looked at me and said, "You are no longer our daughter." Brian had to be physically restrained by 3 men as he threatened to kill me. His face was contorted with rage as he shouted that he would make me pay for this. Some of the guests started filming everything on their phones, while others quickly left the church, whispering among themselves. I didn't stay to see what happened next. I grabbed my purse and ran out of the church, got into my car, and drove straight to my friend Sarah's house. I knew I couldn't go home. Within hours, I started getting texts from cousins telling me that my parents had changed the locks on the guest house. They had thrown all my belongings onto the front lawn in garbage bags, not caring that it had started to rain. Update 3: It's been 3 months since I exposed Brian at his wedding, and my life has changed completely. I've been staying with my friend Sarah, sleeping on her pull-out couch and trying to rebuild my life. The first few weeks were the hardest. I had to scramble to retrieve my belongings from our parents' front lawn in the rain, and many things were damaged or stolen before I could get to them. Sarah has been amazing through all of this. She helped me find a new job at her company, which pays significantly better than my old one. I'm now working as a project coordinator, and my new boss actually appreciates my work instead of constantly comparing me to my brother. I've started saving money and should be able to afford my own apartment in a few months. About a month ago, I received a text from an unknown number. It turned out to be Melanie. We met for coffee, and she thanked me for stopping her from making the biggest mistake of her life. She told me that after the wedding disaster, she started digging into Brian's past and discovered he had been cheating on her with multiple women besides Lori. Several of his ex-girlfriends reached out to her with similar stories of manipulation and cheating. Melanie has thrown herself into her work, earning a promotion at the hospital where she works. She said she feels like she dodged a bullet, and while the embarrassment of a called-off wedding was hard to deal with, it was better than being trapped in a marriage with someone like Brian. As for Lori, she moved to Arizona to live with her aunt. I heard through mutual friends that she had the baby, a little boy. She tried to get Brian to take a paternity test and help with support, but he blocked her on everything and denies the child is his. His lawyer sent her a cease and desist letter when she tried to contact our parents about it. Brian's life has completely unraveled since the wedding. Melanie's father made good on his threat about the wedding expenses and is suing Brian for over $75,000. The video of his meltdown at the church went viral on social media, leading several other women to come forward about his behavior. 2 of his female co-workers revealed he had been harassing them at work, leading to an HR investigation that ended with him losing his job. My parents, predictably, are still defending Brian. They've been telling everyone who will listen that I made up the whole thing because I was jealous of Brian's success and happiness. They claim I edited the recording to frame him and that Lori is lying about the baby. My mother has been posting long rants on Facebook about how daughters should be loyal to their families and how I'm dead to her. Some relatives have sided with my parents, sending me nasty messages about how I've brought shame to the family. But others have reached out in support. My Aunt Linda, who had always seen through Brian's act, offered to help me with a deposit on an apartment when I find one. Several cousins have told me they always knew something was off about Brian but were afraid to speak up. I won't lie, losing my family has been painful. There are days when I miss my old life and the security of having a place to call home, even if it was just a guest house. But I don't regret what I did. Every time I think about Melanie almost marrying someone who saw her as nothing more than a meal ticket, I know I made the right choice. Sometimes standing up for what's right means losing people you thought would always be there for you. But I've learned that real family isn't about blood, it's about people who support you when you do the right thing, even when it's hard. I'm building a new life now, surrounded by people who value honesty and integrity over blind loyalty to toxic family members. Brian and my parents made their choice to support lies and manipulation. I made mine to stand up for the truth, and I'll live with the consequences knowing I did what was right.